Witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie. A ja już po angielsku powitam naszego gościa, Avi Yamini. Hello Avi, are you still with us?
I'm with you. How you going?
Great, great. So let me introduce you real quickly for those of you who don't know Avi. You are an Australian Jew. You currently live in Australia. You're a political activist, commentator, internet personality. And also in March 2018, you ran for council, a member of council in Australian Liberty Alliance as a Victorian candidate. And you're also written for Times of Israel, appeared in numerous Australian television shows, including The Project, Sunrise, Today Show. And in 2009, you've founded line of Israeli Defense Force Krav Maga-based training gyms in Melbourne, Victoria. So thank you very much for being with us today and for taking part in this discussion. So let's start perhaps with the recent topic of Black Lives Matter protests in Australia. You've been to the protests, and interesting situation developed there. You spoke with the attendants there about Justin Damon, the Australian who was shot dead in her pajamas, also in the same city where the George Floyd event took place, by a black police officer, but none of the attendees ever heard Justin Damon's name, never heard anything about her, and there were no protests in her name in Australia. You spoke with the attendees of the protests about her, about Justin Damon, and they haven't heard about her. What are your thoughts on this?
I think firstly, thank you for having me. I think first it shows that these protesters are professional protesters. They don't know anything about the issue, and they when you just ask them for something so simple like Justine Damon is an Australian. She was killed by the same police force. Why don't you know her name? It didn't even register. And then when you gave them a moment to think about it, and I would put to them, well, the difference in this situation is that the victim was white and the perpetrator was a black cop. They suddenly ran away. They didn't want to talk to me, which is interesting because they first were willing to talk to me because they look at me and they think, oh, he's a person of color for sure. He wants to, he's on our side. And the best part of it is that the video has been seen, I think, now 5 million times in Australia, which means we're about 25 million people, which means that 1 in 5 Australians have seen that and have laughed at those protesters.
So still on the BLM protest topic, I saw on your on your Twitter that you shared video from Hong Kong police. One of the police officers in Hong Kong was chanting Black Lives Matter slogans. What's your take on this, and how likely it is, do you think, that the Chinese communists have something to do with the protests, some part in them?
Well, they've made it clear that they support the protests. And I've said this from the beginning because there are some activists, anti-CCP activists, who have been promoting the Black Lives Matter protests. And I've said from the beginning that you supporting Black Lives Matter as a pro-Hong Kong or anti-CCP activist, you're doing a disservice because you're doing exactly what the CCP is supporting. The fact now that a Hong Kong police is publicly supporting the Black Lives movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, only proves what I've said from day one. The CCP are actively supporting Black Lives Matter. They love it. It supports their agenda, and that we must differentiate between the Hong Kong freedom movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. And even if you support Black Lives Matter to an extent, you need to make sure to make that difference clear, separate them. They are definitely not the same thing. The CCP want nothing more than everybody that supports the Hong Kong freedom movement, to the protest movement, to compare it to the Black Lives Matters movement. That's exactly what they want. They want you, if you support Hong Kong freedom, if you support democracy, they want you to support Black Lives Matter. And I can go through a million reasons why they're different, and you can just start with the looting to begin with.
And I also saw a video, actually before that, can we play for our viewers the video from Hong Kong, which we just talked about, and then we'll come back for more questions.
Black Lives Matters. Black Lives Matters. Black Lives Matters. Here is not America. Here is not America. Okay? Your guys say, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
Thank you much for that. We also know, of course, about Chinese officials who were calling for a meeting between Black Lives Matter movements and Chinese officials, state officials. So let's talk about the influence of Communist Chinese in Australia. Perhaps we can start maybe with Drew Paulo and him being removed from the Queensland University. He's currently suing the university. He's a former member of Senate in the university. What other influences from the Chinese Communist Party have you noticed in Australia?
It's a big problem. In Australia, we have a lot of influence here of the CCP, of the Chinese government. Drew Pavlo is one example. What happened to Drew Pavlo is not okay, and that's because it is the Chinese government influence. But having said that, I in no way support Drew Pavlo as an activist. I think he's also dangerous. He's a far left-wing Antifa supporting, Black Lives Matter supporting, and he loves anarchy. So I think he's problematic in himself. But the fact that China can get any student expelled at their behest here in Australia is very concerning. So here in the state of Victoria, where I live, we've signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is basically a Chinese plan of how to own countries' assets. And you see in countries like in Africa, there are countries where the director of the WHO, the reason why China owns them is because through this Belt and Road Initiative, where they lend countries money to build infrastructure, and when the country or the state cannot afford the debt, which right now, due to coronavirus, a lot of even our state may not be able to afford the repayments, then China suddenly owns that asset. So in turn, China will own, the CCP will own much of the place I live in right now here in Melbourne, Australia. The last point was here only 6 months ago, there was a police station in Springvale, which is probably 15 minutes from where I'm sitting right now, where on the day of the communist birthday, they raised the communist Chinese flag on a police station. So it's not even stealth, it's not even hidden, it's in our face, and they're making moves with the support of some governments here which are practically owned by the CCP in one way or another.
Is there any opposition to this in the parliament, in politics, or is it all very well controlled?
There's strong opposition here in Australia. Here in Australia, we have a bunch of states like we do in America. We have states, and then we have federal politics. Federal politics, both sides, left and right, are against this Belt and Road Initiative, getting into bed with China. Every other state besides Victoria is against this same deal. We are the only state, and he has very strong ties to the Communist Party. So most of the government here recognizes the threat of China, and especially now after COVID-19.
Okay, so that answers actually a couple of questions that we had from our audience about these things. For example, Rafael Bonk was asking, do you see some sort of does the government allow for these protests to take place? Are they sort of silently supporting them? Or Tadeusz Ciszek was asking, in what percentage does the politicians and business people in Australia are connected with communist Chinese, and are Australians aware of it? So maybe talk about this. What percentage of population in Australia are aware of the situation with Chinese influence?
I think now coronavirus has made the entire country aware of the threat of China. So it's funny because I've been advocating against our connections, or our growing connections, our growing reliance on China for a few years now, and suddenly every single person who was apathetic about it and didn't care a few months ago, suddenly everybody has an opinion, everybody cares, nobody wants things made in China even anymore. But the business community here does have very strong ties, and some of the political class also have extremely concerning ties with China, and they don't seem to be moving because they are both guided by money and power. So there is still concerning connections, but the people have woken up, which is a blessing through coronavirus.
Rafael Michta is asking, how does the situation with 5G look like in Australia, and is Huawei going to be taking part in the construction of infrastructure and all things to do with 5G?
To be fair, I'm not that, I haven't been watching closely the 5G implementation in Australia. I do believe Huawei is involved, but I don't know, because I've been looking at the bigger picture. I know a lot of people have concerns with 5G. Some seem legitimate, others seem a bit far-fetched, but I don't really know.
While we wait for the further questions, let me ask you about coronavirus, since you mentioned the topic. What are your thoughts so far on this virus? We know you definitely have the opinion that it's coming from China and CCP is responsible, but can you tell us a little bit more about what you think about this virus and pandemic right now?
I think that I think coronavirus certainly started. It's a real thing. Firstly, I do think it's real. My cousin died of coronavirus in New York. But I think that it started in mainland China. I don't believe the story that it started in a wet market. I like a lot of people, can't trust a word the Chinese government say about it. I believe that it, one way or another, came out of that lab. The question is, was it on purpose or was it an accident? But I'm proud that Australia is leading the charge with the independent inquiry into the source of the virus, and what we all suspect will one day, one way or another, come to light, and we'll hold the CCP to account.
Thank you very much, Avi, and we're sorry to hear your loss. We also think that the virus is real. Certainly now nobody can deny that the amount of people died is not something that you can. Some people say it's a conspiracy theory, but I think it's ridiculous. Let me ask you a question we have from Rafael Bonk about Hong Kong and Taiwan. What is the stance of your government and also of the opposition in Australia towards Taiwan, Hong Kong? And does the government or politicians want to support their freedom and their fight against communist Chinese, or are they planning to help?
So I think the Australian government stance has generally been to support freedom and democracy, at least taking a public stance of such. But they very much tread carefully because we are a big trading partner with China, and they don't want to lose that. So whilst our government fully supports the Hong Kong democracy movement and Taiwan, and have said things to that effect, they also played the political game. They haven't put any sanctions on China, which is what I would like to see as an Australian citizen. I would like to see our government punish China for their actions in Hong Kong, for Taiwan, and for coronavirus.
We have a question from Marta. Do Australians, did they fall for this narrative that COVID-19 doesn't exist, or that it's not very, dangerous?
There's a very, very small minority of Australians who don't believe it exists. I think most Australians are quite level-headed. They can see it's real. They think we should tread carefully. We're doing quite well. We haven't had many cases. But at the same time, they also want to see us start the economy again, because whilst that everybody understands the real threat of the actual virus, they also recognize the real threat of shutting down your economy and just basically calling it quits on everything else because of a virus.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Some countries like Taiwan and New Zealand, we know, have reacted quite quickly to this pandemic, and they have implemented a quite harsh form of shutdown, which was actually supported and agreed with by the populists. So people in the country had faith in the government and implemented the guidelines. And thanks to that, they're in much better place compared to all the other countries that didn't implement the shutdown, where the people didn't trust the government, and now they're still struggling with the pandemic. It's hard to get it sort of beat this virus, and they're still having problems with it. Have you noticed a connection from this double punch? From one side, the pandemic has hit the countries, and on the other hand, you have communist propaganda, like anarchist propaganda as well, calling people to stop trusting their government. And do you see any correlation between those two?
I think what I have seen happening is that the Communist Party have been trying their hardest to use the situation to their benefit, to try twist the reality, to spread a false narrative, to either get people not to trust their government when it comes to the way that they perceive China, or just undermine that relationship. But I think it's all backfired. I don't think anything the CCP has done during this pandemic has worked in their favor. And I think the only thing that they've played in a way well has been comparing Hong Kong to Black Lives Matter, because some people have fallen for it. But aside from that, nothing else they have done. Nobody trusts them. Nobody believes them. Even those that have fallen for their comparison of Black Lives Matter to Hong Kong still hate the Communist Party, hate China.
So we know you're really passionate about Hong Kong, and since you brought up the topic, let's switch to that. Can you tell us why do you support Hong Kongers? Why did you get involved in this topic and so passionate about it? And also to Polish people, why should they care? Because some Polish people here don't care.
Well, Hong Kong is just on the front line of all of our fight. If you, no matter where you are, in Australia, America, Britain, Poland, doesn't matter where you are, if you think that communist China doesn't pose a threat to you, you are in denial. You're living a fantasy, because they may not be now targeting you or directly targeting you. Once they come for us, once they beat us, they'll come for you. Once they beat Hong Kong, once they take over Hong Kong, they're just going to expand. They have an ideology that they want to spread around the world. They want full control. So to think that it's not our fight is a mistake. But the reason why I'm passionate about it is because, firstly, I'm passionate about freedom and democracy. I think, I'm a real human rights activist. These human rights activists who like to go on about their little causes, they actually they're not consistent. I believe that everybody should have an equal right. Everybody, we are all equals, and we all have that right to self-determination. And I fell into it because I would talk to mainland Chinese people on the street, interviewing them, and I realized that the problem is so deep in these people that if we don't do something now, and we don't stand with Hong Kongers to fight against what is happening, then this will move in on, especially Australia. In Australia, we have students from China, from mainland China. We have our universities like Drew Pavlov. They're run by mainland China. So if we don't do something now and stand with Hong Kongers now, then our ending here is going to come much sooner than any of us anticipated.
Thank you much, Avi. And final question from our audience, Piotr Zawrocki is asking, where do you get the strength to fight for freedom? And also, can you tell us on a personal note about the incident that happened earlier this year, with your heart stopped?
So I'll go to the first one first. How do I gain the strength? My mum always says, people say, Avi, how are you so brave to go and confront these people on your videos? And the only person that has it right is my mother. She goes, Avi, I thought when you were born I gave you brains. It looks like you're lacking brains. And with my cardiac arrest sudden, so it is, what I went through was it's called a sudden cardiac arrest, which is the biggest killer for men, healthy men under the age of 40. The second biggest is suicide, and both are probably because of women in their lives. But you know what? It confirmed to me everything I was doing, the way I was living was actually right. It's worth living for something. And we can die so suddenly that I don't want to end my time in this world without having done something that hopefully my kids and grandkids and next generation could and should and would be proud of.
We have a question from Eunika, one of our editorial team. Why are you an anti-communist?
Because I'm pro-democracy, because I'm pro-freedom, because I'm pro-capitalism, I'm pro-living a good life. I'm pro my neighbors living a good life and self-determination, and people having the power to be able to do what they want with themselves and their lives and their family. Freedom, something that we see under communism, is lacking.
Thank you much for that. Thank you much, viewers, for your questions. Avi, any final words before we part for today to our Polish viewers?
Pozdravia.
Thank you very much. So with us today was Avi Yamini, the reporter for TR News. Thank you very much for taking time to speak with us. If you want to follow Avi's work, he's very active on Twitter, Avi Yamini or Ozrieli on Twitter. So please follow him and support his work. Please send our best regards to all the TR News team and Tommy Robinson as well, of course. And you can always count on us to tell the truth about what's going on there in Australia and our support for what you guys are doing in TR News. So thank you very much for being with us, Avi, and God bless.
Thank you guys.
Dziękuję bardzo Państwu, że byliście z nami i do zobaczenia o 13.